I grew up in New York, in a town so small most GPS apps still spell it wrong. My parents' place was out on Route 9, past the last gas station, past the sign that says pavement ends, on a gravel road called Whitfield Lane that dead ends into about 40 acres of hayfields and second-growth forest. I moved back there in the fall of 2023 after my divorce, into the same house I grew up in, because my mother had passed the year before and my dad needed help with the property, and honestly, I needed somewhere cheap to lick my wounds. I was 34. I'd been a dental hygienist for almost a decade, and I picked up part-time hours at a clinic in Cortland, about 25 minutes away. My dad, Ron, was 68, retired from the county road crew, the kind of guy who still checked the propane tank every single morning out of habit, even though we'd had the same delivery schedule for 15 years. It was just the two of us in that house, plus a dog named Biscuit who was mostly deaf and completely useless as any kind of alarm system, which matters later. The house itself is a plain two-story farmhouse, white siding gone a little gray, built sometime in the 1930s. There's a wraparound porch on the south side, a detached garage my dad uses as a workshop, and behind that, a tree line that separates our property from the old Delacroix land, which had been sold off in pieces over the decades to a logging company and then to nobody, as far as any of us knew. It's just woods now. Nobody's supposed to be back there. I want to be clear, this town is spooky in the way people think of spooky. It's not foggy graveyards and old churches. It's satellite dishes and pickup trucks, and the Dollar General being the social hub on Friday nights. That's what made what happened feel so wrong. It didn't fit into any story shape I already had in my head. It started small, the way these things always seem to when I look back on it, though at the time I didn't think anything of it. In late October, I started noticing the motion light on the garage kept tripping at night. My dad had installed it years ago because we'd get deer, sometimes a bear if the compost pile wasn't secured. I'd hear the faint click of it through my bedroom window, which faces that side of the property, and I'd glance out and see nothing. Just the empty gravel drive, the black shape of the garage, the tree line beyond it swallowing the light before it got very far. This happened maybe 3 or 4 times a week. I mentioned it to my dad and he shrugged and said, probably raccoons, we'd need to clean the compost bin out. Then on November, I remember the date because it was the day after Halloween and I'd worked late restocking candy at the clinic's front desk display, which is a stupid detail to remember, but it's the kind of thing that sticks. I got home around 6:40 p.m. It was already fully dark. My dad's truck wasn't in the driveway. He'd gone to a Legion meeting in town. I let Biscuit out to do his business by the porch steps, and while I was standing there in my scrubs with my arms crossed against the cold, I noticed the workshop light was on. It wasn't the motion light. It was the actual interior light of the garage, glowing yellow through the single window on the side door. My dad never left that light on. He was borderline religious about electricity bills, a leftover habit from raising 3 kids on a road crew salary. I stood there for a second, feeling that specific kind of confusion that hasn't tipped into fear yet, just a small mental note that something didn't match what I expected. I walked over, called Biscuit to follow me, and pushed open. The light was on. Nothing else seemed disturbed. His tools were where they always were, the ride-on mower under its tarp, the smell of 2-stroke oil and sawdust exactly the same as always. I flipped the switch off, locked the door behind me even though we never locked it, and went back inside. When my dad got home, I asked if he'd left the workshop light on. He said no. Sure. He said he remembered specifically turning it off because he'd been looking for a torque wrench before he left and had to feel around near the door for the switch in the dark for a second. We didn't make a big deal out of it. We talked about the possibility that the switch was faulty or that one of us had just forgotten. I want to be honest that even now, knowing everything I know, I can't swear that light bulb wasn't just a normal mistake. That's the frustrating thing about all of this. Nothing, until the very end, was undeniable. Over the next 2 weeks, small things kept happening. The kind of things you explain away individually and only add up in hindsight. One morning, which we kept around the side of the garage, moved about 10 feet from where they were supposed to be. Lids still on, nothing spilled, just moved. My dad blamed a bear, though it was getting cold enough by then that most of the local bears should have started denning up. Another night, old, half-deaf, generally unbothered by anything short of the vacuum cleaner, stood at the back door for almost 20 minutes around 11 p.m., just staring out into the dark yard. Not barking, not whining, just standing there with his ears up in a way I'd never seen him do. I watched him from the kitchen table while I finished a bowl of cereal, feeling an itch at the back of my neck I couldn't explain. And eventually, He just walked away and curled up on his bed like nothing had happened. The first real jolt happened on November 19th, a Sunday. I remember because I'd been on the phone with my sister Danielle, who lives in Syracuse, catching up about Thanksgiving plans. It was around 9:15 p.m. My dad had already gone to bed. He's an early riser. I was sitting in the living room with the TV on low, some rerun of Forensic Files playing more as background noise than anything I was actually watching, when I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Not the wind, ranch. Actual footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The specific creak, creak, creak of our particular porch boards, which I would know anywhere because I grew up walking across them 1,000 times. They went from the south end near the swing toward the front door and stopped. I sat completely. Danielle was still talking in my ear about turkey brining, and I said something like, "Hold on," in a voice that must have sounded strange because she immediately asked what was wrong. I told her it was on the porch. We have a doorbell one my dad bought off Amazon 2 years ago. Motion activated, syncs to an app on his phone and mine. I pulled it up while Danielle stayed on the line. The little loading circle spun for what felt like forever on our garbage rural internet, and when the clip finally loaded, it showed nothing. Empty porch, empty steps, timestamp 9:14 p.m., 11 seconds of footage, motion triggered, and not one thing in frame. I told myself the camera's motion sensor could have been triggered by a moth near the lens, that the footsteps were a settling house, that I was a 34-year-old woman spooking herself over nothing while going through a rough year. I did not sleep well that night. I kept my bedroom door locked, which was something I'd never done in that house in my entire life. I didn't tell my dad about the porch thing right away, mostly because I didn't want him thinking I was losing it, or worse, thinking he needed to start worrying about me on top of everything else he already had on his plate that year. That was a mistake. I know. Things went quiet for almost 2 weeks after that. No lights, no footsteps, nothing. I actually started to relax, chalk the whole thing up to grief and stress manifesting in weird sensory ways, which a therapist I'd seen a few times after the divorce had told me was a real thing that happens. I went back to my normal routine: work, dinner with dad, occasionally driving into Cortland to see a friend from high school named Kayla, who tended bar at a place downtown. Then came December 3rd. I'd worked a full day and gotten home around 6 p.m. My dad's truck was gone again. He'd started going into town more that winter, I think partly because he could tell something was off with me, even though I hadn't said anything specific, and he does that thing some men of his generation do, by staying busy and present without directly asking what's wrong. I let Biscuit out back, like always. It was maybe 25 degrees, clear sky, that kind of hard winter silence you get in the country when there's no wind and the cold seems to swallow every sound. I was standing on the back steps in my coat, waiting for him to finish, breath fogging in front of my face, when I heard, from somewhere out past the tree line, not close, but not as far as I wanted it to be, a man's voice, low. I couldn't make out words, just the tonal shape of someone speaking, like a single sentence, maybe two, and then nothing. I called Biscuit inside immediately and locked the door. I stood in the kitchen with my heart going and told myself it could have been someone out on the old logging road that cuts through the Delacroix land. Hunters sometimes used it even out of season illegally, or someone on a phone call walking their dog back there, except I couldn't think of anyone who lived close enough on that side for it to make sense. Our nearest neighbor in that direction, a retired couple named the Austers, lived almost half a mile through the woods, and it's not the kind of ground you walk casually in December. When my dad got home that night, I told him everything. All of it. From the beginning, the light, the trash cans, Biscuit at the door, the porch footsteps, and now the voice. I watched his face change as I talked. That particular shift from a father humoring his daughter to a father actually getting concerned. He didn't sleep in his room that night. He sat up on the living room couch with his old shotgun leaned against the armrest, something I'd genuinely never seen him do in my entire life. Not even the year we had a string of break-ins 2 towns over. For the next several nights, and I want to stress how much worse that nothing felt than something would have. Waiting is its own kind of exhausting. I was checking the driveway every time I pulled in from work. I started parking closer to the porch instead of near the garage. I stopped letting Biscuit out back alone. On December 11th, a Monday, my dad found something in the workshop that changed the whole shape of what we thought was happening. He'd gone in to grab a socket wrench around 7 a.m. before I left for work, and he called me in before I could leave. On the workbench, next to his tools, someone had left a granola bar wrapper. The cheap kind, off-brand, not anything either of us bought. And beside it, half melted from the workshop's residual warmth, a candy cane, like the kind that comes in a box of 24 from a drug. It hadn't been there the day before. My dad was certain, because he'd been in there working on the mower's carburetor that whole Sunday afternoon, and would have seen it. That was the moment it stopped being something we could explain as animals, or wind, or stress. Someone had been inside our garage, overnight. While we were both in the house, we called the Cortland County Sheriff's Office that morning. 2 deputies came out, walked the property, checked the tree line, found what one of them described as some flattening in the brush along an old deer trail that ran roughly toward the back of our land, toward the Delacroix property, but nothing conclusive, no clear footprints, ground too frozen and covered in leaf litter to hold a decent impression. They took the wrapper and the candy cane as evidence, more as a formality than anything, I think, and told us to keep the doors locked, get better cameras, and call immediately if anything else happened. We got a full camera system installed within 4 days. Motion-triggered floodlights around the whole perimeter. My dad also, without telling me until after the fact, started sleeping with the shotgun loaded, which I know now made my mother's old wedding china rattle in the hutch every time he chambered around to check it. A sound I can still hear if I let myself think about it too long. For almost 3 weeks, the cameras caught nothing. Life started to feel almost normal again, in that fragile way where you're still braced for something even as you go through the motions of your regular life. Then, on the night of 2024, at 2:47 a.m., the motion floodlight over the garage triggered, and this time, the new camera caught it. I've watched that clip more times than I want to admit. In the recording, the light snaps on, illuminating the gravel drive in stark white. For about 4 seconds, nothing. Then a figure moves into frame from the tree line side, a man, medium build, wearing what looks like dark coveralls and a knit cap pulled low, face never fully visible because he keeps his head angled down and slightly away from the camera the entire time, as if he already knew exactly where it was mounted. He walks with an unhurried, almost casual pace across the edge of our yard, pauses near the garage door. Not trying the handle, just standing there for 11 full seconds, facing the house, and then turns and walks back into the tree line and is gone. The whole clip is 19 seconds long. What still bothers me, more than anything else in this entire story, is that 11-second pause. He wasn't trying to get in. He wasn't looking around like someone casing the property for theft. He was standing there, facing our lit windows at 2:47 in the morning in 18-degree weather, completely still, like he was just checking, confirming something, making sure we were home maybe, or making sure we knew he could be there whenever he wanted, close enough to see us, without ever needing to come inside. We gave that footage to the sheriff's office. They ran it, said the build and gate didn't obviously match anyone in the county's system, that the angle and low light made facial recognition useless, and that without a clearer identification, there wasn't much more they could do beyond increasing patrol frequency on Whitfield Lane, which they did for a while. After that night, my dad and I made the decision to put motion sensor lights on timers, straight through the tree line edge of the property. We got a second dog, a much younger and much more alert German Shepherd mix named Duke, and I started keeping a bag packed by my bedroom door, just in case, which is a thing I still do now, over 2 years later, in the apartment I eventually moved into in Cortland proper. Because here's the part that never got resolved. The part that still keeps me up some nights even now, safely tucked into a duplex on the edge of town with neighbors on both sides and a deadbolt I checked twice before bed. The activity never happened again after January 6th. Not the lights, not the footsteps, not the voice, not one more incident, all the way through the rest of that winter and into spring, right up until I moved out that June. It just stopped, completely, the same way it had started, with no explanation, no arrest, no name. My dad still lives in that house. He says nothing's happened since, and I believe him. He's got the cameras, he's got Duke, and he's got that shotgun a lot closer to hand than he used to keep it. But every time I visit for a holiday and walk past that stretch of tree line on the way to the mailbox, I find myself glancing toward the old logging road, half expecting to see a shape standing there, watching, the way it must have been watching us for weeks before we ever knew it was there at all. We never found out who he was. We never found out why our house, why that stretch of woods, why us specifically out of every farmhouse scattered along that road. The sheriff's department eventually closed the file as inactive, no leads. Sometimes I think about that 11-second pause in front of the garage and wonder what would have happened if one of us had stepped outside right then, if we'd caught him standing there in the light, instead of only ever seeing it after the fact on a screen. I still don't know the answer. I don't think I ever will. Story 2. The rideshare pickup outside Quartzsite. I want to start by for a rideshare app part-time, even after everything I'm about to describe, because I need the money, and because most nights are completely fine. I think that's important context. This isn't a story about how driving strangers around at night is inherently dangerous. It's about one specific night, one specific pickup, and the 6 weeks afterward that made me install a second dash cam and start telling my sister exactly which route I was taking before every late shift. My name's Trent. I'm 29, I live in Yuma, Arizona, and back in early 2024, I was driving for one of the big rideshare apps on nights and weekends to supplement my job doing HVAC installs. Yuma's not huge, but it sits close enough to the I-10 corridor that I'd sometimes get pinged for rides way out past the city limits. Snowbirds needing airport runs, guys getting off shift at the Marine Corps base wanting to go somewhere in Somerton, that kind of thing. Long fares paid well, so I didn't mind driving. On the night of February, a Friday, I was parked in a gas station lot off 4th Avenue around 11:30 p.m., waiting on my next ping, half watching a rerun of some sitcom on my phone with the sound low, drinking a monster I probably didn't need at that hour. The app buzzed. Pickup address was out on Highway 95, north toward Quartzsite, almost an hour out. Fare estimate was good, over $90, which for a Friday night in Yuma is not nothing. I accepted without thinking twice. The pickup pin looked like a house just off the highway, a little past the Quartzsite town line, in that stretch of desert where the development just kind of gives up, and it's scrub brush and rock formations, and the occasional trailer, or double wide, sitting way off the road behind a chain link fence. I'd driven through that area before for other fares, so it didn't strike me as unusual at the time. Rural Arizona's full of houses like that. I got there around 12:35 a.m. GPS said I'd arrived, but there was no house visible from the road, just a long dirt driveway, maybe a quarter mile, disappearing into darkness with no porch light, no motion light, nothing. The app doesn't let you see much beyond the pin and the passenger's first name, which in this case was just Mike. I texted him through, "Here, don't see a house from the road. You want me to come up the driveway, or are you walking out?" No response, which felt long sitting there with my hazards on, engine idling, nothing around me but dark scrub desert and the hum of my own AC. Then a reply, "Coming out now, stay there." I want to describe what that stretch of highway felt like at that hour, because it matters for what happened after. There's no cell service dead zone exactly, but it's thin. One bar, sometimes none. No streetlights past the Quartzsite exit. The sky out there is stupid huge and clear, more stars than I'd ever admit to finding pretty under normal circumstances, and the temperature had dropped into the 40s, cold enough that I'd cracked my window and could smell creosote bush, that sharp, rain-on-desert smell. Even about 7 minutes after the text, I saw a flashlight beam bobbing down the dirt driveway, getting closer. A man emerged from the dark and walked up to my car. Mid-30s maybe, flannel jacket, jeans, baseball cap pulled low, average build, nothing alarming on the surface. He got in the back seat, said, "Sorry man, phone was dying," in a completely normal, almost friendly tone, and gave me a general direction. "Just head back toward town, I'll tell you where to turn." That's not unusual. Plenty of riders don't set a precise drop-off, especially if they're heading somewhere without a clean address. I started driving back south on 95 toward Quartzsite proper. For the first 10 minutes, totally normal ride. He made small talk, asked if I did this full time, told me he was staying out at a buddy's place for a while, mentioned something about work being slow. Nothing about him raised any flags. I remember he had a specific smell to him, like stale cigarette smoke mixed with something sweeter, maybe cologne, and he kept his backpack in his lap the whole ride instead of setting it beside him, which I only really registered as odd in hindsight. Around 12, as we were coming up on the outskirts of Quartzsite, he asked me to pull into the parking lot of a closed gas station instead of continuing toward whatever address he'd apparently been planning to give. Said he needed to grab something real quick. "My buddy's meeting me here." I said sure, pulled in, left the engine running. He got out, walked toward the dark side of the building, out of my headlights' reach, and I sat there for a minute checking my phone, expecting him to come back in a minute or two the way people usually do for a quick errand mid-ride. 4 minutes passed, then 6. I called out his name, well, Mike, through my open window and got no answer. I checked the app. The ride was still active, meter still running, which meant he hadn't ended it, which meant technically I wasn't supposed to just drive. At 12:59 a.m., I got out of the car to look toward where he'd walked, my own footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the cracked asphalt of that empty lot. That's when I noticed a second vehicle parked at the far end of the lot, tucked close to the building, lights off, that I hadn't clocked when I pulled in because I'd been focused on where my rider had gone. An older sedan, dark-colored, hard to tell exactly what shade under the sodium light from the one working street lamp nearby. I couldn't see anyone stood, but I had the specific, prickling certainty that someone was. I got back in my car. I didn't want to seem like I was panicking, so I gave it another minute, engine running, doors locked, watching both the space where he disappeared and that parked sedan in my mirrors. At 1:03 a.m., my rider came back around the corner of the building, alone, backpack now noticeably fuller than before, and got back in without any explanation beyond, "Sorry, my buddy had to grab me something." I asked, as casually as I could manage, if his friend needed a ride too. He said no, laughed a little, said, "He's good," and gave me a new destination, an address that turned out to be an extended stay motel just off the interstate back near Yuma. I dropped him there. He tipped in cash, said, "Appreciate it, man," and walked into the motel breezeway without looking back. I drove off, and honestly, by the time I got home that night, I'd mostly written the whole thing off as a weird but ultimately harmless fare, the kind of story you tell other rideshare drivers to compare notes with, not something you lose sleep over. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 weeks. On February 23rd, a Friday again, I was working an HVAC install during the day in a neighborhood off 16th Street, and during lunch, I checked my phone and saw a local news alert, a small one, the kind that barely makes it past the county page, about a missing person out of La Paz County, a 22-year-old woman named Ashley who'd last been seen at a gas station in Quartzsite in the early hours of February 10th. The article didn't have much detail, no suspect named, no real leads mentioned, just a description and a request for tips. February 10th, night after my ride. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything about it. I told myself it was almost certainly a coincidence. Quartzsite's a real place with real people living real, sometimes messy lives, and missing person cases happen for 100 mundane reasons that have nothing to do with random Uber pickups. But something about the timing, and about that fuller backpack, and about the sedan idling with its lights off in an empty gas station lot at 1 in the morning, wouldn't leave me alone. I pulled my dashcam footage, my rideshare app records, some trip data automatically for safety purposes, and I still had the raw video on my dashcam's SD card from that night, since I don't clear it often. I watched it back at my kitchen table around 9 p.m., blinds shut, which in retrospect is a very specific kind of decision to make about how you want to watch a video. But the footage from the pickup itself showed pretty much what I remembered. Him walking up the dirt driveway, getting in, the conversation. But the footage from the gas station stop showed something I hadn't clearly registered in the moment. My dashcam has a slight side-angle field of view, and in the corner of the frame, right as he's walking off toward the dark side of the building, you can see, very briefly, a second figure already standing near that dark corner, waiting. It's maybe a second and a half of footage, low light, grainy, could genuinely be almost anyone or anything given the quality, but there's a shape there that's not just shadow. Someone was already positioned at that exact spot before he even got out of. I called the tip line listed in the news article that same night. I gave them the date, the approximate location of the pickup, and the gas station, described the rider as best I could, and said I had dashcam footage I could send over. A detective from the La Paz County Sheriff's Office called me back 2 days later, asked a lot of questions, took the footage and my rideshare trip ID. I never got a follow-up with any real resolution. I called twice more over the following month asking for updates and was told both times, in that careful non-answer way law enforcement gives you, that it was still an active investigation and they couldn't share details. I checked local news periodically for a while. Ashley was never found as far as I know, not as of when I'm writing this. Her case still shows up occasionally in local missing persons roundups. A photo of a smiling young woman with dark hair next to a description that doesn't remotely capture what I picture when I think about that dark corner of the gas station. Here's the part that turned this from a troubling coincidence into something that actually changed how I live. About 3 weeks after I gave my statement, in mid-March, I was working a night shift again, parked at that same gas station on 4th Avenue in Yuma, waiting between fares, when a ride request came through. I opened the app to accept it and saw the passenger's name, Mike. Same first name. First names aren't unique. I know there are probably 100 mics active on that app in the Yuma area at any given time, and I want to be honest that this is the weakest part of my whole story, the part most easily explained away. But the pickup pin, when it loaded, was for a spot on Highway 95, almost the exact same stretch heading toward Quartzsite. I didn't accept it. I let the timer run out, watched the ping disappear, and sat there in my car with my hands actually shaking a little, in a way I don't think I've fully explained to anyone since. Not even my sister, who knows the broad strokes of this story, but not that specific detail. I turned my availability off for the rest of that night, drove straight home, and didn't take another late-night fare for almost 2 weeks. When I did go back to it, I put a hard rule in place for myself. No pickups north of the Quartzsite town line, no exceptions, no matter what the fare estimate says. I've turned down at least 4 good fares because of that rule since, and I've never once regretted it, even though I have no actual proof any of it connects to anything. I don't know if he had anything to do with Ashley's disappearance, or if I happened to give a ride to someone who just had an unlucky coincidence of timing and location on the worst night of a stranger's life. I don't know who was standing in that dark corner of the gas station, waiting for him, or what was in that backpack when he got back in my car, noticeably heavier than when he'd left it. The detective never told me anything definitive, and I've made peace, more or less, with the idea that I might never know. What I can tell you is that every time I drive north on 95 now, even in broad daylight, even just passing through on my way somewhere else entirely, I glance at that gas station as I pass it, at the dark corner of the building where the streetlight doesn't quite reach, and some small, stupid part of my brain still expanding there. Story 3. The apartment above the laundromat in Presque. I moved to Presque, Maine in the summer of 2023 for a job as a night shift respiratory therapist at the regional hospital there. I'm from Massachusetts originally, and Presque is about as far north as I'd ever lived, close enough to the Canadian border that in the winter the wind coming down from Quebec makes even a short walk to your car feel like a genuine survival exercise. I took the apartment mostly because it was cheap and close to work, a one-bedroom on the second floor of an old brick building on Main Street, directly above a coin laundromat, with a separate side entrance and a narrow staircase that led up to just 2 units, mine and one other. My name's Renee. I was 27 at the time, single, no pets, working 3 or 4 12-hour night shifts a week, which meant my sleep schedule was basically inverted from everyone else's in the building. I'd get home around 7:30 a.m., blackout curtains up, asleep by 9, awake sometime in the mid-afternoon. It's a strange way to live, and it does something to how you experience a place. You become aware of the building's nighttime sounds in a way most people never are, because for you, night is just an ordinary stretch of daytime with the lights off. The other unit on my floor, across a narrow hallway with worn brown carpet and a single flickering overhead bulb the landlord never quite got around to fixing, was occupied by a man I only ever knew as Gary. I met him properly maybe 2 weeks after moving in early July, when we crossed paths on the stairwell. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavyset, quiet in a way that read as awkward more than threatening at first. The kind of guy who says, "Hey," without quite making eye contact and then hurries past you like the interaction cost him something. My landlord mentioned once, in the offhand way small-town landlords tell you things about your neighbors, that Gary had lived in that unit for close to 11 years. Worked some kind of overnight stocking job at a grocery store outside town, and mostly kept to himself. For the first few months, that was the extent of it. Occasional nods in the hallway, the muffled sound of his TV through the shared wall some afternoons, always turned down low. Some kind of talk radio or news channel I could never quite make out the words of, just the cadence of voices. The first thing that actually stuck with me happened in late September, a Tuesday, I remember, because I'd had a rough shift. We'd lost a patient, a bad night all around, and I got home around 7:45 a.m. completely drained, wanting nothing more than to shower and sleep. As I came up the stairwell, I noticed Gary's door was slightly ajar, maybe 2 inches, which was unusual. He was famously particular about locking up, according to my landlord, had even asked at one point for an extra deadbolt installed at his own expense. I didn't think much of it beyond a passing, "That's odd," went into my apartment, showered, and went to bed. When I woke up around 3 p.m. and left to grab groceries, his door was shut and locked like normal. I figured he'd just stepped out for a minute, and I'd caught it at a weird interval. Small thing. Forgettable, except that it turned out to be the first entry in a pattern I wouldn't recognize as a pattern until Over the following month, I started noticing small sounds from his apartment at times that didn't match any version of a normal schedule for a man who supposedly worked overnight stocking shifts. I'd hear him, or assume it was him, since there was no one else it could reasonably be, moving around in there at 8, 9, 10 in the morning, right when I was trying to fall asleep after my own shift. Not loud, just present. Footsteps, the specific creak of what I guessed was a closet door, occasionally a low murmur of a voice that I told myself was probably a phone call, or the radio, or him talking to himself, the way people alone a lot sometimes do. The thing is, if he worked overnight stock, he should have been sleeping during the day too, same as me. Our schedules should have overlapped in dormancy. Instead, more mornings than not, I'd lie there in the dark behind my blackout curtains, exhausted, listening to him moving around like he'd just started his day instead of ending it. I mentioned this, half joking, to a coworker at the hospital named Priya, who laughed and said maybe he had a second job, or insomnia, or was just one of those guys who never really slept right. Reasonable explanations. I mostly let it go. The specific night everything shifted for me was November 14th, 2023, a Tuesday again, which I only note because it's strange how certain days of the week seem to recur in memories like this, whether or not there's actually any pattern to it. I'd worked a double, got home around 8 a.m. absolutely wrecked, and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime around 1 p.m. to a very specific sound, my apartment door handle being tried. Not knocked on, tried, the distinct metallic rattle of someone testing whether a doorknob would turn, followed by a pause, and then the same rattle again, softer, like someone testing with a bit more caution the second time, aware they might. I lay in bed frozen for a moment, my heart going, telling myself it could be the landlord, could be a delivery, could be a dozen normal things. I got up, moved toward the door as quietly as I could on the old creaking floorboards, and looked through the peephole. Nobody there. I want to be clear that our hallway is short and narrow, maybe 15 feet from my door to the top of the stairwell. No side branches, no closets, nowhere to duck out of sight in the time it would have taken me to cross my apartment and look. I opened the door anyway, heart hammering, and the hallway was completely empty. Gary's door across from mine was shut. I stood there for probably a full minute, in a t-shirt and sweatpants at 1 in the afternoon, staring at his closed door, feeling the specific, useless anger and fear of not being able to prove something had just happened, even though I was completely certain it had. I didn't sleep the rest of that day. I called my landlord, a guy named Pete who managed a handful of properties around town, and told him what happened. He was sympathetic, but not especially concerned. Said the building was old, doors and frames shift, sometimes handles rattle from vibration in the building, especially with the laundromat's industrial dryers running below us all day. He offered to have someone come check my lock, which I accepted, though the lock itself turned out to be... I want to say I dismissed it after that. The way you talk yourself into dismissing things when the alternative is admitting you're scared in your own home. But I started changing small habits without fully articulating why. I started using the deadbolt and the chain both, every time, even for 5 minutes. I started parking my car so I could see it from my bedroom window. I began saying a quick, "Hey Gary," whenever I passed him in the hall, not because I liked him particularly, but because some instinct told me it mattered that he knew I was paying attention, that I registered him as a specific person and not just background noise in my life. Through the rest of November and into December, the pattern of daytime movement in his apartment continued, and twice more, once in early December, once just before Christmas, I woke to that same door handle rattle, always in the early to mid-afternoon, always while I should have been deeply asleep, always with nobody visible in the hallway when I checked. Each time, I didn't sleep the rest of the day. Each time, I told myself it might be nothing, and each time, some more honest part of me knew I didn't believe that. The detail that was easy to genuinely frightened came on January 6th, 2024, a Saturday. I'd had the day off, which was rare, and had gone out with Priya for dinner in town, gotten home around 10 p.m., normal hours for once. As I came up the stairwell, I noticed a folded piece of paper wedged into the door frame of my apartment, right at eye level, tucked between the door and the frame, the way you'd leave a note for someone. I almost didn't. I stood there in the hallway for a long moment just looking at it, then unfolded it with hands that weren't entirely steady. It wasn't threatening, not overtly. It was a single line, handwritten in blue ballpoint, in small, careful, almost cramped handwriting. "You should keep your radio down at night. I can hear everything." I don't own a radio. I don't play music at night. I sleep during the day, and I'm at work most nights. And on the nights I'm home, I'm usually asleep by 10, with the TV off and my phone on silent. I stood in that hallway rereading it, trying to make it make sense, and it wouldn't. There was no version of my actual life that note applied to, which meant either it wasn't really about me, maybe left for the wrong door, maybe a mistake, or it was about me, but based on something that wasn't true, or something I wasn't aware of. Or something meant less as information and more as a way of telling me he was listening closely to a version of my life that didn't exist, which felt somehow worse than if he'd been right. I didn't confront Gary about it. I know, looking back, that might have been the moment to, and I've turned that decision over many times since. Instead, I called Pete again, told him about the note, and this time he sounded genuinely concerned, said he'd talk to Gary directly, professional landlord to tenant, nothing accusatory, just checking in. Pete called me back 2 days later and said the conversation had been strange. Gary had denied writing any note, denied any of the door rattling, seemed, Pete's word, cagey about it, wouldn't quite look at him during the conversation, kept steering things back to how long he'd lived there and how he'd never had any complaints before. Pete said he didn't have grounds to do much more than note it in Gary's file, but he did offer, unprompted, to let me out of my lease early if I wanted. No penalty, given I took him up on it. I moved out at the end of January 2024 into a different building on the other side of town, above a hair salon instead of a laundromat, with 3 other units on my floor instead of one shared neighbor, which felt, at the time, like the single most important factor in choosing a new place to live. I never saw Gary again after the day I moved my last box out, when he happened to be coming up the stairs as I was going down, and we passed each other in that narrow hallway without a word, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something old-fashioned and slightly too strong, and I remember he didn't look at me at all, kept his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder the entire time, which somehow bothered me more than if he... I checked in with Pete a few times over the following year, mostly out of a curiosity I couldn't quite let go of. As far as he knew, Gary still lived there, still worked his overnight stalking job, never caused any other issues that Pete heard about. No other tenant on that floor, before or since, apparently ever complained about anything similar, which is its own strange, unsettling detail. Either I was singled out for some reason I never identified, or I simply got unlucky in a way nobody else did, and there's no way for me to know which. The thing that's still door rattling, more than the note itself, is the timing. If I really was asleep during the day the way I should have been, the way any reasonable schedule would predict, I never should have heard that door handle turning at all. I only caught it because I happened to wake at exactly the wrong moment, 3 separate times, months apart. I've done the math on this more than I'd like to admit. The actual likelihood of randomly surfacing from a deep, exhausted, post-12-hour shift sleep at the precise handful of minutes someone happens to be testing your door 3 separate times over 2 months, and never once catching them in the hallway afterward. I don't have an answer for that. I never will. I still live in Presque, still work nights at the same hospital, and my current apartment has a deadbolt, a chain, and a door reinforcement bar I bought online that I use every single night, regardless of what shift I'm coming off of. Some nights, lying in my new apartment listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a building I've now lived in longer than I lived above that laundromat, I still catch myself listening for a particular sound, a specific rattle, a particular cadence of footsteps that I know, logically, has no reason to be there anymore, and hasn't been, not once, in the 2.5 years since I moved. But I still listen. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through all 3 of these. I know none of them wrapped up clean. No arrests, no confessions, no tidy explanation at the end that lets you breathe easy and move on with your night. That's kind of the point, honestly. Real stories don't usually hand you a bow to tie around them. They just end, and the people who live them are left carrying the parts that never got answered. Renee still habit. Trent still won't cross that line on Highway 95, no matter what the fare looks like. And somewhere out past that tree line in Cortland County, there's a man whose face nobody's ever seen clearly, who might still be out there, or might not, and no one's ever going to know for sure. If any of these hit a little too close to home, if you've got your own story about a night that didn't add up, a neighbor who watched a little too closely, a stretch of road you won't drive alone anymore, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started exactly that way. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that bell, because these true horror compilations go up every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss the next one. And hey, if you're watching this alone, late at night, with the lights off, maybe double check that lock before you close the... Stay safe out there. I'll see you in the next one.